Welcome to Better Without Billboards, a podcast from Adfree Cities all about outdoor advertising, why it's bad and what we can do to reclaim our public spaces.
In this episode, Nicola talks to Alice Ferguson from Playing Out and Charlotte Gage from Adfree Cities about some of the solutions to the worrying decline we're seeing in children's physical and mental health. They explore the many ways in which advertising is messing with children's minds and fundamental rights, whether outdoors or online, and ask what we can do about it. Let's catch up with Nicola's conversation in the studio now.
Hello and welcome to the Better Without Billboards podcast. I'm Nicola from Adfree Cities, and today we're talking about the impact of advertising on children and what we can do about it. Now, this is a huge and really important issue which I know lots of people are concerned about, whether you care for or work with children or not, or whether you work in policy making, health, with community groups, education, or so many other areas. At Adfree Cities, our aim is to create happier, healthier public spaces, and that means free from corporate advertising. It also means asking what we do need instead. What do we want from our public spaces? So whether or not our cities and public spaces are child-friendly, and how can we make them more so, is a question that we're really interested in and excited by. So, today, I am delighted to be joined by Alice Ferguson from Playing Out. Hello, Alice.
Hi.
And by Charlotte Gage, also from Adfree Cities. Hello, Charlotte.
Hiya.
Lovely to have you both here today. Thank you so much for joining me. Now, Charlotte has just launched a new citizen science project that you can all get involved in. So we're looking forward to hearing more about that. But let's start by having a chat to Alice Ferguson. Alice, welcome to the Better Without Billboards podcast. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, Alice, can you start by telling us a bit about Playing Out? Who are you and what problem is it that you're trying to solve?
Well, to start with the problem, children right now are not okay. We might think that the children in our lives seem all right, but the big picture is actually that children's physical and mental health in this country is at an all-time low. Children are not getting the physical activity they need to be healthy, to be fit and well. Less than 50% of children in this country are actually getting the minimum recommended amount of physical activity, and about 30% are getting a lot less than that, basically completely sedentary. Children's mental health, as we probably all know more about because we hear about it more in the news, is also in crisis. I don't think is too strong a word to use, but we're not really addressing the root causes of this or even talking about the root causes of it. Why have we let things get so bad for children, and what's behind it and what needs to change to restore children's freedom, to give children back their childhood and their health and their happiness. And just to say as well, all of this is massively exacerbated by inequalities. So children who already have the least are suffering the most from all of these health problems. The statistics are really shocking. So to sort of bring in where Playing Out kind of fits into that, as parents of young children, about 15 years ago, a group of us got together. We were all feeling, even for our own children, that things weren't right, and that compared to our own childhoods, where we'd had, quite a lot of freedom, we'd spent a lot of our time outside with other children, playing, exploring where we lived, having adventures, even just being able to walk to school by ourselves unaccompanied from a reasonable age, that our children had lost that basic freedom, that everyday experience of just being able to go out the front door, walk down the road, call for a friend, go to the park, and everything that comes with that. So, everyday physical activity that we had from that, that experience of being outside without anyone even really thinking about the health benefits of it. We were getting that daily dose of physical activity that we needed. We were getting social contact. We were developing skills, learning to ride bikes, learning to deal with different situations that we experienced in the real world, developing a sense of independence, confidence, just so many things that, most children got from that very, very normal experience of just being outside around their local area. And we just felt very strongly as parents that children now were missing out on something very essential. And, it wasn't about being nostalgic. This was about children have essentially not changed. Their needs haven't changed, but the world around them has changed and has made their lives very restricted and very isolated and very sedentary. So we, as a group of parents who were sort of also quite active in our community, activists, I suppose, wanting to change things, we tried to think, like, what could we do to start changing things for our children and for, children in the area generally where we lived, and bigger picture. So we initially came up with this idea of play streets. So my neighbour Amy and I developed this very simple model on our own street where we would close the road to through traffic for a couple of hours after school and just give back that space to children to play on their doorstep, to kind of come together, to meet, to have fun, and to sort of also bring the adults out and demonstrate how simple it would be to kind of restore that freedom and that experience for children. And, we very strongly felt that the main barrier, the main thing that was stopping our children having that freedom was traffic, was the sense of, it not being safe for them to be out in that space. So we really wanted to kind of demonstrate that in a very tangible, visual way and show that if you took away that particular barrier and that threat to children, that they could, they would very naturally come out, play, be active, be sociable. And that is exactly what happened.
Can you say a bit about why you think we're in this crisis?
I mean, we've obviously thought about it a lot, how we've got to this place. And I think it's not that anyone set out to, destroy childhood or take away children's freedom in a conscious way. It's just that it's inadvertently happened because children haven't been considered, they haven't been prioritized. There's a vicious cycle in a way where the less children have been considered, especially in terms of the way that we plan our cities and our environment, the less children have become visible, like a visible part of society, and therefore they're even less considered. So I think that's probably the underlying reason, is that we just haven't thought about children as being citizens in the same way that, we consider adults to be. I think there's probably also within that just a lack of understanding about what children actually need. There are sort of assumptions made that, we can meet children's needs through organised activities, but that's not the reality. Children need free play. They need to do their own thing. They need to have some agency over their own activity. And and they need that everyday freedom, just being out and about. So I think those are the basic underlying causes. Children's needs have been bottom of the pile, and they've been subsumed to kind of adult needs and desires, an adult view of the world. And there are legal and policy problems behind that I could talk about. But and I think cars, the fact that we've, as a society, prioritized people's convenience to own a car, to get around by car, that this kind of whole culture of car dependency has sort of been encouraged and imposed on us to a certain extent as a society. And children are the biggest victims of that. They haven't benefited from it particularly. Children can't drive a car, so it's not increasing their freedom, but they are the most vulnerable group when it comes to traffic danger. It's the second highest cause of child mortality, is being hit by a car as a pedestrian. It's a huge problem that we don't really talk about.
Yeah, so there are a lot of problems there, which means there's a lot of opportunities to make things better. What do you think, Alice? How could our towns and cities be better meeting children's needs? Sounds like there are some quite obvious ways in which policies could be tackling this.
So I think, big picture, we need to make children a high priority across decision making, across policy areas. So at the moment, children are only really considered within the realm of education and social care, I would say, and maybe a little bit in public health. But the main policy areas that people think of in relation to children are those very narrow, specific areas. And when it comes to housing, to planning, to transport, to all these other huge policy areas, decisions are made without thinking about children in general. So one of the reasons underlying that is that, unlike other groups, children are not considered an equality group. So they don't have to be considered as a group when it comes to planning decisions, for example. So I think we need to look at the law. We need to look at how that can be rectified. And I mean, equalities law, I think, should definitely include children as a group on the basis of age, because they have their own needs, and they have their own vulnerabilities like any other equalities group. So yeah, big picture, I think that's what needs to happen. And then the result of that would be, we're actually creating spaces and places that work for children, where they have this access to the space on their doorstep that they need to be able to just, go out the front door and play and connect with other children. That's a very basic kind of deep need that children have that's currently not being met. So at the moment, some of the barriers to that doorstep play are traffic, like I've said, but also policies around housing that allow housing providers to put up no ball game signs or to exclude children from the use of space. So all of that really needs to be challenged from a child rights point of view. And that's something that we are doing and working with housing providers to try and start shifting that culture as well. And also, alongside the sort of doorstep space, we need to look at children's wider freedom. How do they get to other places and spaces that they need to? How do they get to the local park? or the shops, or, just to be able to have the ability to roam, to explore a bit, as again was normal maybe 40, 50 years ago. And again, that is a case of policymakers, decision makers consciously thinking about children when they're planning an area. And one of the projects that we're working on at the moment actually is a proposal for a child lens on transport policy, particularly. So trying to propose, a almost different paradigm for how streets are planned, looking at it through the eyes of a child. How does this street work for an 8-year-old? Would they be able to cross it without a parent, for example? How does it feel for a child? So all of that would ultimately create an environment that works for children, and an environment that works for children would work for everyone. I think, that's a really good principle to work from. Even if you don't particularly care about children, it makes sense, because if you think about children, you get it right for everybody, but it doesn't work the other way around.
Now, that all sounds like there's lots of stuff that could be done. And I know that, so at Adfree Cities, one of the things that we are really inspired by are the ways in which people really kind of visualise and imagine and show and demonstrate how our public spaces can be different and how spaces in our towns and cities can be different. And you've really done this with Play Streets. That I know that's really taken off. And can you tell us a bit about that, how that sort of spread around the country?
Yeah, Play Streets is a really simple idea. So the model is that a group of neighbours gets together, decides they want to do this maybe once a week or once a month, and they apply to their council to get a road closure order for those regular times throughout the year. And then on the day, they just close the street to through traffic with signs and cones, whatever, make the space safe. And what we've found is, once that space is made safe, children just naturally fill it. They come out and they play as if it's something that they did every day. It's really reassuring to see that, even though the space that we've provided for children has been diminished and shrunk, that instinct that they have to play freely, to be creative, to connect with each other is still intact. And they still very much want that. So Play Streets kind of show a lot of different things. I think they show, like you said, very visually what streets could be like, what our world could be like if we thought about children more and made the space work for them better. They show that children really want that. I think quite often one of the myths that we have to push back against is this idea that, the reason the children aren't out is because they just don't want to be. They want to be inside on their phones, and it's kind of blaming children basically for the situation that we've created as adults. So I think what we've found is, once they've got the opportunity, so the elements really being a safe space on their doorstep, permission to be out there, and other children to play with, once those kind of factors are in place, children just want to be out there. When they're out playing, they are naturally physically active. So I think that's another thing that Play Streets demonstrate, is that you don't need to be telling children to do 50 star jumps. When you give them space and freedom to play, they get that physical activity without even thinking about it. So Play Streets also show that a lot of parents really want this for their children as well. I think that's another myth, that parents have become so risk averse that they don't want their children to even like be outside in case they scrape their knee. I think that's absolute rubbish. I think parents have a very real and understandable fear of their children being hit by a car, but most parents are sensible enough to know that, you know, if their children are playing and being a bit wild and a bit, you know, taking risks within a safe space, they might, you know, they might have bumps and scrapes, and that's fine. That's part of it. So yeah, so I think as a demonstration of all those things, play streets are a very valuable model. Also, play streets are not the ultimate answer. You know, we're talking about 2 or 3 hours a week at most that people have the kind of the time and energy to get together and make this happen. And that's not enough. Children, you know, need this every day. You know, playing out should just be part of children's everyday life. So we've always seen play streets as just a stopgap. It's like a way of giving children a little dose of what they need. But more than that, it's a culture changing model. So it's hopefully getting people to think more and be more aware of what children have lost, what they need, what we need to do about that, you know, what needs to change, and kind of showing the huge benefits that children and everybody would get from bringing about those changes.
I'm so interested in what you said about this perception that parents are risk averse. I mean, you're right. You know, cars are a really genuine, real threat to children, and something that I think as parents we all worry about. But I suppose this idea that parents are risk averse is sort of ironically and unfortunately playing into pushing children more onto screens where actually they are exposed to harms, which we can't all see all the time. So there's a sort of additional problem there, isn't there? And I wonder if that brings us on to talk. Thank you very much, Alice. I wonder if that brings us on to talking to Charlotte now. So Alice was there. There's lots of things to pick up on there, but perhaps the first one might be, you know, Alice was talking there about how, you know, we need to think about how children get from place to place. And Charlotte, I know that the visual environment that children experience is really important to you, and particularly around advertising. Can you just start by telling us a bit about what impact you think advertising has on children?
Thanks. Yeah, so we did a bit of a deep dive into research that's already been done around children and advertising to find out what's out there already and what we know. And unfortunately, it's not a very good picture. We know that children are impacted by advertising from a very young age, just by seeing brands around or by having that in their world through the screens that they look at, but also through the ads that they see as they walk down the street. So they can recognize brands before they can even talk, a lot of kids. And then that means that they then have that kind of brand recognition and relationship with those brands, which could potentially last a lifetime. And we know that the kind of ads that children are seeing in the street tend to be ones for products that aren't necessarily very good for their health. So it could be for fizzy drinks or junk food or for gambling. Vaping is another one. It's a new thing that you can see in advertising in the street because there's a weird loophole, which means that vaping ads are allowed to be shown on outdoor advertising, even though they're not allowed to be shown anywhere else. So when kids are going down the street and on their way to school or from school, wherever they're going, they are seeing ads for products that we know are harmful to their health. But then because that's a recognition and they're seeing those ads again and again, and they're kind of normalized, because if you're seeing these ads on the street and then you're seeing them at home, you might be seeing them on YouTube when you're watching films there, or on TV, in magazines and papers that your parents have as well, then that normalizes those products and says, oh, these products are fine. And surely that's okay for us all to have them. And then the brand recognition kicks in as well. Like kids are then asking for those products, wanting to have them all the time. And they're just a part of their life. And then that moves on to adulthood, which is why we can see these high levels of obesity and other health issues, public health issues, which we're beginning to really understand now that advertisements are part of this environment that's created, which is a public health issue for children and then into adulthood as well.
Do you know what, Charlotte? While you're talking, you're just making me realise that while I don't remember a great deal from my early childhood years, there are definitely advertising jingles that I remember absolutely word for word from when I was really quite young. And I expect that's the same for all of us, right?
Absolutely. So there are these things that become really normalized. They're fun, they've got bright colors and shapes, and obviously adverts are supposed to bring attention and supposed to be remembered so that when you go in the shop, you're then going to buy that product or ask your parent to buy that product. So of course they're fun and exciting and they make us want them because that's what adverts do.
I'm also remembering when I was a child and friends of mine would have those NatWest pigs that you collected because you opened an account with NatWest. And I expect there's lots of ways in which kids are kind of bribed in their early loyalties to brands like that, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. But then because we have so much time online now and that online world and screens is so much part of our world, advertisers know this as well. And so they're using all sorts of very nefarious tactics to get in there early with kids, particularly, and like getting data points on them and building like data point systems so that they know exactly what to advertise them and when and how to reach them really. So there's some really scary stuff around that because they understand how much kids are online, either on their parents' phones or on their own screens, and then on with TV as well, where they can build these profiles of children to then follow them later on in life as well. And actually, Global Action Plan have done some really interesting work around surveillance advertising of children, how totally ridiculous this is in terms of how many data points might be on a 13-year-old or whoever. And actually, it's really dangerous because parents, again, don't really have an understanding of this or how to stop it happening. So, as you were saying, the online world is also very dangerous for children.
I was just thinking, as you were talking, Charlotte, that there is such a strong relationship between what playing out's about and what you're talking about, in that the more children have been sort of excluded from, pushed out of public space and essentially kind of pushed indoors, the more exposed they're going to be to that online world of advertising. It's just inevitable. I mean, as a parent, that it's very difficult to keep children off screens when they don't have the alternative option to go outside and play with other kids in real life. But also the public space advertising is even less under parents' control, isn't it? So, that's the space where when you are walking your kids to school, or maybe they are out and about, starting to be out and about a bit more independently, they don't have a choice but to see it. It's completely imposed on them. And probably more than adults, they are going to be susceptible to those messages and those images. So yeah, it's just another way in which we're kind of imposing the adult world and the commercial world on children, and occupying their eyes and their brains as well as their bodies.
It feels surprising that this is allowed to me, doesn't it? And I'm wondering, Charlotte, what you've told us about the tactics there. Are companies allowed to do this? Are advertisers allowed to manipulate children in this way?
Yes, unfortunately they are. I think because potentially policy and legislation hasn't really caught up with what they're doing. I don't think there's a real understanding of how this works and how they can be targeted through social media, through all their profiles online, and through everywhere that they are, basically, that they are able to be targeted by marketers. So I think the government is beginning to maybe catch up a little bit We're really pleased to have heard the recent announcement that there will be a ban on junk food advertising to children. So on TV before the watershed, 9 p.m, and also online. But as you just said, Alice, that doesn't cover outdoor advertising. And those are the kind of ads that we can never turn off or never have any control over because they're just there all the time. So we would like to see a wider ban on all those kind of unhealthy junk food products across all advertising because, yeah, wherever you see it, it's going to have an impact on your health.
Charlotte, there is some restriction, isn't there, on advertising junk food to children in public space? Can you tell us about that?
There's a small restriction in that you can't put a junk food ad 200 meters from a school. But yeah, children don't exist within a bubble where they're just at home or just 200 meters from their school. So obviously that's ridiculous. But what's interesting about that restriction is that it shows that there is an understanding that there's a problem with junk food advertising to children and that actually it shouldn't be happening because there is some kind of restriction. So yeah, that's an interesting one. But obviously children are traveling to and from school down main roads, on the bus, where they're constantly being bombarded by adverts for junk food because the marketers know that's where children might well be. So yeah, that is a
It's
really
also, yeah, it's very telling, isn't it, that that restriction is so specific to the very immediate area around a school, as if that's the only realm in which children exist. And it's a reflection of how children are thought about in our society and in our politics.
Yes, absolutely. And just to go back to that point on schools, when we were gathering research, we found a lot of awful information also about the impact of advertising in schools and how this is increasing in the UK. Like we knew already that there was some really bad stuff going on in the US, and then you've got things like well, just the food available in schools and the machines and that kind of thing, which are selling all sorts of products which we know are unhealthy for kids. But now there are more and more products which are available that schools can use as part of education, which include advertising, and are linked to wider advertising companies. Like there are kind of Facebook tools and Google tools and things like that, which teachers might be using because they haven't got that much money in their school, but are then linked to advertising and products directly because that's where the money's coming from. So it's really insidious. It's getting in everywhere in every part of our children's lives. And that's why I think people understand it's a problem, but they're not willing to go far enough to actually ban these unhealthy adverts across all sectors.
And can I just, aside from the content of some of those adverts, which obviously is a whole problem in itself, what about the actual physical impact of public space advertising for children? Is that something that you've looked into? So I suppose I'm thinking of, when I used to walk my kids to school, there were big billboards in the middle of the pavement, just basically blocking the pavement. But also, adverts that could very, very easily be a distraction to drivers, as an additional safety issue for children walking to school or, just out and about.
Yeah, street clutter is a huge issue in terms of restricting space on pavements for anybody using that pavement. And also as a distraction for drivers, as you say. So yeah, if we're thinking about children in public space and we're worried about them and cars, then that's another reason to think, well, drivers aren't going to be looking properly, or there's going to be blocks on the pavement so they can't see what's coming. So yeah, they're a huge issue. I think we at Adfree Cities would agree that the fact that you're allowed to put any kind of digital advertising near a road to distract drivers does seem like incredibly unsafe. Or to put any in the pavement to restrict access for wheelchair users, people with buggies, or anyone really. Yeah, they shouldn't be there. They shouldn't be taking up our public space like that. And in terms of children using our public space, I suppose by having all these ads and the space taken up by these digital billboards and these messages, it's just a way to kind of say that this space isn't for them. and that it's a space for advertisers, it's a space for adult products, it's a space for things that are getting in their way and are not allowing them to use that public space in their community in the way they might want to. So to have those messages as you're walking down the street, rather than trees or a park or a community mural or whatever it is, that it actually makes the space feel like your community, your neighborhood, and a space for you. I think that's outdoor advertising has a huge impact on children in that way.
Now, Charlotte, we just talked about car safety again, and I should say that you've just written a really excellent briefing on the impact of advertising on children called Consuming Childhood, which we'll share in the show notes and people can take a look at. In there, you explore what you see as the link between the sort of aspirations to own bigger, safer, so-called safer cars that we're sort of driven to do by advertising and risks to children in public space. Can you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, so increasingly we're seeing that most of the advertising for cars on outdoor advertising spaces is for SUVs. And there's a real push in this country for people to buy bigger cars. And like you said, the argument is if you're a family and you want to keep your children safe, you buy a bigger car and you kind of protect them within this armored tank. And it doesn't really matter about anybody else on the street, so pedestrians and cyclists and anyone walking down the street. But there's this sort of drive to these really big cars to protect children and make families safe. But the reality is these huge cars are taking up a lot of space on roads, on pavements where children now can't scoot, cycle, walk because the cars are in the way. But also they're actually a direct danger to children, because they're so huge, you can't see children walking in front of them. And there's an increasing number of children who, when they're hit by these cars, are dying. As Alice was saying, there's high numbers of children dying on the roads. These kind of SUV cars are explicitly more dangerous to children. Yet we're seeing them more and more on urban streets, on streets where people live, because there's this push through advertising that we should be all owning these cars because they're safer for our families.
Yeah, okay. So it seems that we sort of do know some of the things that need to be done. Policy change isn't happening fast enough. Advertising regulation is failing us. But what can we do? I mean, I know one of the things that you think we should be doing, Charlotte, is to talk to children about advertising. How can we do that?
So alongside the Consuming Childhood report, we've launched this Ad Spotters project. So we've done Ad Spotters in the past, and this time we're looking at children and parents and families. So we're asking people to just have a look on their way to or from school, or when they're out and about in their local community. What adverts can you see and where do you see them? And a lot of people might say, oh, I don't notice them. But actually, if you start to look, you might see them on old phone boxes that aren't used anymore, or on bus stops, or there might be billboards if you look up. And this is just an opportunity for us to start having these conversations with kids. So what do you see in your local community? How does that make you feel when you see those adverts? What do you think this is advertising, and how is it trying to make you want to buy that product? And it's just a good opportunity to start having those conversations, because I think a lot of children don't really notice advertising because it's become so much part of their environment in all ways. But if we start asking questions and challenging and critiquing the messages that are coming from advertising, then hopefully children can be a bit more aware of that and actually think about that in terms of, do I want this thing that's being advertised to me? Why is this thing being advertised to me when it's bad for the environment or it's bad for my health? So we just want to start those conversations with parents, carers and kids to try to push back against advertising that we do see and challenge it and critique it a bit more.
Do you know what? It makes me slightly angry as a parent that it's down to me to try and help my children understand what the harms of advertising are. I'd really rather they just were not exposed to it at all. But that's the grumpy part of me. And the realistic part of me says, look, it's there, isn't it? It's in their lives. We need to help them identify it. I mean, I know that my children, they can't tell. They're my eldest is 5. He can't tell the difference between an advert and information. And that's a big problem, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. That's what we found in our research as well, was that the age that children can actually tell that an advert is an advert and that it's trying to sell them something is actually older than you would expect. So often with TV adverts, children can't really tell the difference between the content cartoon that they were just watching and then when an advert comes on. And so we really need them to help them to understand that this is a marketing mechanism that is trying to sell them a product that they wouldn't necessarily want or need otherwise. So having these conversations with ad spotters and what they're seeing in their environment outside is part of having that conversation about what advertising does and why it's targeting them.
Great. So great. Yeah, let's talk to our children more about advertising. And as always, when we talk to children, they'll come up with excellent questions and ideas that we never thought of that will help us in these conversations. I wondered about just before we sort of start wrapping up, because I know we need to do that soon. I wondered if we could come back to talk about planning. You know what's in my mind, Alice, is that I know that you've spoken before about this kind of, you make the point that in planning decisions, we need to take into account the great crested newt, but we don't have to take into account children, which I think is a really great way of illustrating how children are ignored in these processes. I wonder if you both might have something to say about how we could include children in those decisions more. Is it by actually going out and talking to them, including them in focus groups, things like that?
Yeah, I was just thinking, as Charlotte was talking, one brilliant thing about the Ad Spotters campaign is it is, giving children a voice. It's respecting their opinions, their views as citizens. And I think we just need to start doing that more in general, because, children do, when you ask them, they do have really good insights and thoughts about their environment, what's good about it, what needs to change, how it makes them feel. And we've done projects in the past with children in Hartcliffe in South Bristol, a very, very disadvantaged area, where children did their own research about the area, what was stopping them from being able to be outside and play, or just children's thoughts about all of that. And they came up with, brilliant findings about what needed to change to kind of make their area better for them and for everybody, which is on our website if anyone wants to look. And they made a film about it. But yeah, so I think giving children more of a voice, but also listening to what they say, taking it seriously and acting on it, if we're in a position to do so, is the key thing. I think too often there's a tokenistic attitude to kind of children's participation, where they're not, they're just asked to give their views, but nothing really happens as a result. And that can kind of make them feel even more powerless than they did already. So I think, it's something to be careful of. But yeah, just to come back to the question about planning, I think that is a very, very key area where, all of this needs to be looked at properly, and children need to be much better considered. So this year there've been a couple of different opportunities to feed that into government policy. So we were part of a parliamentary inquiry on children in the built environment that unfortunately got halted because of the general election being called. But before that, a lot of evidence was submitted to this inquiry from over 130 different organisations and individuals, experts, all coming at it from different angles, but all saying the same basic thing, that children are not being properly considered within the whole realm of built environment policy, and that planning in particular needs to change and address that. And then more recently, actually, there was a consultation on the National Planning Policy Framework that a lot of people also responded to from that angle, saying, against the currently ridiculous situation that newts and bats get more consideration within planning law than children do, and pointing out the outcomes of that, that we've created a lot of places, housing estates, streets that just do not meet children's needs, and that's having a very tangible impact on children's well-being. And if this government is serious about its ambition to create the healthiest generation of children in history, I think they've said, this is a really, really crucial area for them to look at.
So yeah, in our response to the NPPF, the National Planning Policy Framework consultation, we've put a big onus on letting people know what's happening in their local area. So the fact that people don't even know that a big digital screen is going to go up like near their home, because that it's hidden away on the council planning portal. So yeah, we've said that local people should know. There should be notices to local organisations, like schools. Like we've found cases where they would have a planning application in to put up a screen, a big digital screen, like right in front of a school or right in front of a nursery, and that place had no idea it was going to happen, and the children weren't asked if that's what they would want. That every time they go into nursery or go into school, there's a big digital screen blaring out adverts. So yeah, that's a big part of our request to government is around notification, because the impact of a digital screen on a community is huge because of the light pollution and the images being shown. So they should have a say. They need to know. And also, I just wanted to say on positive stories. So one of the things that our local groups do are called cover-up actions. And that's a way to reclaim some of advertising public space back for communities. And we often find with the cover-ups that loads of kids get involved. They really love it. So a cover-up is when you get a really big bit of paper and you put it over an existing advertising site, normally on a pavement unit. And then you write a question, or you just give people pens and say, like, go for it, do what you want. What would you rather see in this space? And we often get a lot of kids writing things, drawing pictures, because they really enjoy interacting with that space and having the freedom and the possibility to do what they want in that space rather than being dictated to by advertising. So that's a really positive thing that people can do anywhere in their local community, and we'd encourage you to.
I think that's so important. And it's another thing I didn't really say about the Play Street model also is just the way it gives children that sense of autonomy and belonging and ownership of the space that is on their doorstep. And children quite often do vocalize that. They say things like, this is my street, or this is a beautiful space, or they actually like, but they just show it as well in the kind of the joy and the way they express themselves. And it's, I think, so important to restore that for children.
So, Alice, what's the number one thing you'd like people to do who are listening to this podcast at the moment?
I think maybe just look around and think about how things could be different, how we could, better consider children's needs in our local environments. Maybe there are small actions that people can take to start actually doing that, changing things, whether that's, organising a Play Street, which, anyone can go to our website and find out how to do that, or other things, thinking about lobbying the council for safer routes to schools or parks, or there are lots of ways that I think as citizens we can start trying to change things locally. But bigger picture, I think, just remembering that children are essentially the same as they have been forever, for generations, and that it's a very short amount of time that children have not had that freedom to to play out, to be outside, to connect with other kids locally, and I suppose just start thinking about the impact of that and the implications of that, and what we need to do to start pushing back on that.
Thank you. And Charlotte, can you tell us again how we can get involved with AdSpotters?
So AdSpotters is very simple. You just need to look out for any ads that you can see on your way to and from school or wherever you're going. So spot them. Then you need to catch them. So use a phone or borrow someone else's phone to just take a picture of the ads that you've seen. And then you can upload them to social media with the hashtag AdSpotters, or send them to us directly. So we're trying to get an idea about what ads are out there. It's really useful to see what ads are actually on our streets and that kids are seeing. But also then, as we said, it's an opportunity to have a conversation with the children in your life about advertising, what it's doing, why it's there, and what they'd like to see there instead.
Great, thank you. And thank you both very much again for joining the podcast today. It's been a really enlightening, sometimes shocking and frustrating, but most of all inspiring conversation, which has hopefully inspired everybody to go out there and help create more child-friendly spaces, whether that's by closing your own street for a little while, lobbying for policy change, recording and resisting ads where you live. And I hope that as we approach the dreaded annual festival of consumption that is Black Friday, that you're all managing to avoid ads as much as possible. And do talk to your kids about that as well. We'll all be seeing them. So once again, thanks so much, Alice and Charlotte, for joining us. Do check out the show notes for more links to Playing Out and AdSpotters, and get snapping those AdSpotters photos. So I'll just give you a chance to say goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you very much for having us.
And we'll see you next time on Better Without Billboards. Thank you.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, then please subscribe, and if you can, please share this podcast with a friend or two. To find out more about Adfree Cities' work, head to adfreecities.org.uk or find us on Twitter and Instagram at Adfree Cities. Thanks for listening, and fuck adverts.